Uh, I'm patting my pocket, pat your pocket, and take out your phone or a buzzer or whatever you have, and please turn it off. I'll try to remind you before you leave to turn it back on. Our next meeting, which is going to be so different than today, will be Monday, April the 7th. We have really loaded you down for March. But it's going to be with Gail Sussman, and she is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She was born in a displaced persons camp in West Berlin after World War II. And we have the privilege of sharing her personal journey through the significant chapters of history. And the people that survived that time in history are slowly disappearing. So this is a very special program. So please bring those you know who might be interested. Her presentation is going to cover topics like life before the war, the actions of the Einsatzgruppen, I don't know if I got that right, mobile killing units, life in a displaced person camp, and her eventual arrival to the United States, which must have been a huge adjustment. So this is a powerful program. Please bring those you know, who, especially those who say it didn't exist. They might need an eye-opener. So, put down Monday, April the 7th, 10 o'clock, as you know, and we'll see you here. This was a very strange day. When I did the research as to the history, you'll hear as I go through it, there wasn't a whole lot going on, and what went on was strange. In 1492, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon issued the Alhambra Decree, which expelled the Jews from their kingdom. In 1736, the Bellevue Hospital was founded in New York City, and it was the first public hospital in the United States. In 1854, the Treaty of Canandaigua, I don't know if that's correct, under Commodore Perry, forced Japan to open the ports of the United States. In 1870, Thomas Mundy Peterson of Perth Amboy, New Jersey, was the first African American to vote in the United States under the provisions of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in a local election. In 1880, Wabash, Indiana, was the first town to be completely illuminated by electric lighting. And in 1898, the Eiffel Tower was officially opened for dignitaries and an award ceremony in Paris, France. It was designed by Gustave Eiffel and held the record for the tallest man-made structure for 41 years. And in 1917, the Danish West Indies were officially ceded to the United States for $25 million and renamed the Virgin Islands. And in 1918, that was the first time daylight savings time went into effect. In 1930, the Motion Picture Code was instituted, imposing strict guidelines on the treatment of sex, crime, religion, and violence in film for the next 38 years. In 1944, Hungary ordered all Jews to wear yellow stars on their clothing. In 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the Marshall Aid Act to rehabilitate the war-torn Europe. In 1953, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was established. And in 1958, the U.S. Navy formed the Atomic Submarine Division. In 1968, at the conclusion of a national broadcast address on Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson stunned the United States by making the statement, "I shall not seek nor I will accept the nomination of any party for another term as your president." In 1980, U.S. President Jimmy Carter deregulated the banking industry. And this I did not know about at all. In 2014, Elton John and George Clooney called all to boycott hotels owned by the Sultan of Brunei after Brunei passed new anti-gay laws making it punishable by death. Now, birthdays today, and I noticed in my research that composers dominated March 31st. This was the birthday of Johann Sebastian Bach, composer Joseph Haydn, American farm leader Cesar Chavez, American fashion designer Liz Claiborne, stage and screen actor Richard Chamberlain, who we just lost 2 days ago, American actress Shirley Jones, jazz trumpeter Herb Alpert, American actor Gabe Kaplan, and politician Al Gore. And that is history today, March 31st, 2025. And now it is my privilege to turn the mic over to our co-chair, Dr. Ovid Vitas. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry, and good morning. Club member Bill Colleran is a retired system engineer with an extensive experience in the space industry, including NASA Manned Spacecraft Center and the Lunar Module Program. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineer from the University of Massachusetts. After graduating, Bill worked for Boeing and the Minuteman ICBM program in Seattle, and before after that, he relocated to New Orleans, where he spent 2 years planning tests for NASA Saturn's VS-1C main booster. He then joined NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center as a Lockheed engineer, where he worked for 3 years on the Lunar Module Program, overseeing the integration and testing of the research telemetry system for Lunar Modules 1 through 3, with several trips to Grumman's in New York, at the New York facility. In 1967, William joined Raytheon, where he worked for 35 years as a senior system engineer, focusing primarily on naval sonars. His work took him aboard nuclear submarines overseas, collaborating with foreign navies, including those of Spain, South Korea, Italy, and Egypt. His presentation today is titled "The Race to the Moon, a Close Call." So let's give Bill a warm round of applause. Bill?
Good morning. 1965, 60 years ago, I just turned 24. I went to work at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston for Lockheed. I was a telemetry engineer, and this is how engineers dressed in that period of time. Slacks, white shirts, short-sleeved, narrow tie, pocket protector, and slide rules. The visual, the pocket protector, very important, and slide rules, very important. I was a telemetry engineer, and telemetry from the Greek word to measure from a distance. So we would measure, we had voice communications with Capcom, we had some video, but the status of the actual capsule and the biomedical data for the astronauts were by the telemetry link. So it was pressure, temperature, strain, biomedical data was transmitted down to mission control, where the various systems engineers would man the consoles. Let me begin. A race to the moon, a close call? We'll find out. In 1902, one of the first movies in the 20th century was A Trip to the Moon, a French movie based upon the work of Jules Verne. And they had some of it right. They were using the technology of the time, a large cannon, and this flight originated from Tampa, Florida, so they got that right too. The following year, the Wright brothers flew the first flight at Kitty Hawk, and this also a Russian school teacher who was self-taught published a theory of rocket flight, and he hit on several things. It was using Newton's third law for every motion. For every motion, there was an opposite and equal reaction. And he used as an example a man in a rowboat with a bunch of rocks, throwing the rocks in this direction and the boat moving in the opposite direction. So we're going to fast forward and see why we're having this talk. And we're engaged in the moon race with the Republic of China at the moment. And just like the Soviet Union, another empire, we want to take a look back at how we did then. In August of 1955, at the height of the Cold War, scientists established the International Geophysical Year, an international effort for comprehensive study of the Earth's poles and atmosphere. 18-month study taking place in 57 and 58. The United States and the Soviet Union, announced their plans, and they were going to make use of their German rocket scientists, which they had in abundance. Werner von Braun, we all know of him. He was in Rocket Club in the 1930s. The Nazi Party took over. He soon joined in their V2 program. He was instrumental in developing that. People of London and Western Europe understood what happened when rained those B-2s down on them. More people died building them in the salt mines than actually were killed in flight. At the end of the war, he and others were captured by the US and the UK and came to America. They worked for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And 1 second. The Russian Sergei Korolev of the Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union, was also a rocket enthusiast. He was caught up in the Stalin's 1938 purge, and along with many colleagues was sent to rot in the Gulag, including the infamous Kolyma gold mine. At the outbreak of World War II, he and other scientists were sent to prison-like Sharaskas, which were described by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his first circle. He worked with German scientists at the end of the war, and the German scientists were initially given contracts remaining in their homes. After about a year of working with the Soviets, they were transported to Russia against their will, where they were there for several years. In the Soviet system, there were experimental design bureaus in place of corporations. Korolev was a chief designer for OKB-1, but his name was a state secret until his death in 1966. The Soviets commandeered V2 parts and subassemblies from German factories. Historians disagree about the impact of German rocket scientists on the Soviet program. In reality, the Germans did not build anything for the Russians, did not supervise the firings, and did not introduce innovations, wrote German-born rocket historian and von Braun colleague Willy Ley in 1968. I should point out that I was a 14-year-old boy in 1955. I watched von Braun on the Walt Disney Show, and I read articles by him in Collier's magazine. So I had some knowledge of him. On August 21, 1957, the Soviets launched the first ICBM. Why is it doing this? They launched the first ICBM. Maybe someone can help me. The designated R7, called Semyorka, Little Seven. In the fall of 1957, I was a student at one of 7 high schools selected to participate in an MIT physics department program to revamp high school physics. My high school, Taunton High School of Taunton, Massachusetts, was a public school. When the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, this is the size of Sputnik 1. Weighed 186 pounds, but this was the size of it. Back to our talk. When the Soviets launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957, I sat in Mr. Carpenter's physics class and listened to his ham radio, and hearing Sputnik's incessant beeping, suddenly physics was very hot. It had an impact on the Soviet Union. The image of the Soviet Union has dramatically changed, with Khrushchev being Time magazine's Man of the Year. There will be a space race taking place at the peak of the Cold War with a supposed missile gap, and becoming a contest between communism and liberal democracy played out in orbit. Celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Red October, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a dog, Laika. Sadly, Laika did not survive the mission. The U.S. finally gets into the act with an orbit of, in January of '58, Explorer satellite weighing 30 pounds that will lead to the discovery of the Van Allen belts. In 1958, Soviets launched Sputnik 3, a large experiment-laden 3,000-pound satellite. The U.S. launches about 15 Explorer and Vanguard satellites, all under 50 pounds, with about a 50% space success rate. The Time magazine cover here was of interest to me anyway. It featured an article on the physics program I was taking. It's called the Physical Science program. It also features Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was majority leader, but he would become vice president and head of the National Space Council under JFK. And at the very top, you can see an article about a spaceport in Cape Canaveral. October 1, 1958, NASA was created. It's created by incorporating the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, is a mouthful, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, several other agencies, and the Space Task Force under Bob Gilruth. The Mercury program is authorized on October 7, 1958, headed by Maxime Faget, a Louisiana Cajun. He was a lead designer on Mercury and Gemini capsules. He got little credit compared to von Braun, who heard of him. The Mercury and Gemini orbital missions were carried on man-rated Atlas and Agena rockets, not von Braun's Redstone series. The Soviets demonstrated a serious interest in the moon with lunar probes. 1959, Luna 1, a flyby. Luna 2, crash lands near the Sea of Tranquility in September, the first object to escape Earth's gravity. Another example of Soviet one-upsmanship. In 1960, Sputnik 5, Strelka and Belka dogs, On August 17th, 17 orbits. The dogs survived and their first mammals in space. The dogs were sent up in August during the JFK-Nixon presidential campaign. The following year, Khrushchev gifts one of Strelka's puppies to Mrs. Kennedy as a gesture. Here's our friend Maxine from Louisiana. In 1961, JFK is inaugurated. He inherits the Manned Mercury program nearing fruition. He indicates he wished Johnson to act as the president of the National Space Council. James Webb is appointed NASA administrator. He was recruited by LBJ, an accomplished man, educator, marine pilot, lawyer, aircraft company executive, congressional aide, director of the budget, and Undersecretary of State under Truman. Is a resume. In the early days of his presidency, JFK met with NASA officials and his staff in the Oval Office. He wanted bold action from NASA in the face of Soviet space victories. He was given several options: preeminence in space exploration in general, astronauts circling the moon, or a lunar landing of astronauts. At this point, there was no man in space. The Mercury missions. What's going on? Here we have the 7 astronauts. They're 30 to 40 years old. The maximum height is 5'11". Military pilots, at least 1,500 hours in jets. They became household names for exploits in and out of orbit. Gus Grissom, second row center, was the only astronaut that would meet the Soviet height requirements, and we'll find out. The cosmonauts. Here we see the cosmonauts with Korolev. It looks like a school teacher with his rowing team. They're flying the Vostok capsule, maximum height, 5'7", all under 30. They had about 250 hours of flight under them, with right stuff. They were unnamed until after liftoff in the secretive Soviet Union. The method of landing, they had not figured out how to safely land a Vostok capsule, so the cosmonaut would be ejected from about 5 kilometers up and make his way to the ground. And we'll get to that in a moment. The capsule, Vostok meaning east, interesting because the best way of launching a missile, as we know here in the Cape, you launch east to take advantage of the Earth's rotation. The closer you are to the equator, the more advantage you have. Cape Canaveral is at 22, 23 degrees. The Soviets are around 45 degrees, so they have less advantage compared to us as far as physical locations. They're back in the Cosmodrome, which is a fictitious name because the Soviets didn't like to give away where the locations were, so they just renamed things. Titov was the shortest. He flies the first long mission. Anyway, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin lifts off. His words are, "Let's go. I am Eagle." That is his call sign, not bragging. After one orbit, he parachutes, ejects. He's about 200 kilometers short of his intended landing. He has to walk to find a village with a telephone. Serious. While dressed in an orange flight suit carrying a handgun. They carried weapons because sometimes when you landed in the woods, there may be wolves, sometimes bears. The face of the Soviet Union is now a handsome young Soviet jet pilot. The first suborbital flight, Mercury 7, is on May 5, less than a month later. Khrushchev says, "Flea hop." Shortly thereafter, the U.S. was humiliated in the aborted Bay of Pigs invasion, which occasioned JFK's speech before Congress. This is the Vostok capsule, a real one. And you can see its odd shape. And you can see how there would be an ejection right through one of those large portals. Next to it is the Mercury capsule. You can see the difference in design philosophies. You can see the heat shield. It's tapered. They had a heat shield all around because they weren't sure what the orientation would be. Interesting people. JFK addresses Congress, and the speech was entitled Urgent National Needs. In it, he is facing all these new nations that are being formed from former colonies. There are now about 110 UN members when there were only 70 in 1955. His speech to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade is over sets off a huge undertaking that could be comparable to the Panama Canal in time, manpower, and money. A Gemini program is authorized in 1962, and this is authorized after the first Apollo contracts are signed. To do this job of landing a man on the moon and safely returning him, we would need a massive booster. We would need a large command module capable of holding 3 astronauts for up to 2 weeks. We would also need a lot of unmanned lunar probes, Ranger, Surveyor, and Lunar Orbiter, that would take photographs of the moon, or in the case of Surveyor, actually land, so we would find out just how deep the moon dust is. So programs are authorized, and of course contracts have to be bid. Everything is underway except for a method of going to the moon. How are we going to do it? This is a triad. Jim Webb is in the middle. To his left is Dr. Hugh Dryden, a longtime employee at the Aeronautics Lab. To the right is Dr. Robert Siemens from industry. They are the triad. Dr. Dryden dies in 1965. Siemens takes over his position. The 2 men below him come later in the 63, 64. George Miller and General Tom Phillips play a major role in the undertaking. Example of the major systems, in fact, you'll need a huge booster, and they do it 3 different methods. The large Boeing S-1C, which only lasts for 2.5 minutes, is a standard liquid oxygen RP-1, which is like kerosene, but it's the largest booster until this most recent SpaceX. The second and third stages are using liquid oxygen, but liquid hydrogen is in place of the RP-1. There's been very little use of this. There's only been 1 rocket designed with the liquid hydrogen, and that was a much smaller one. The command and service module was mentioned. These contracts awarded before the end of 1961. We haven't decided on a landing mode until late summer 1962. And we'll get into that in a moment. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. Dr. John Hobart was a proponent of this. Von Braun's people wanted an Earth rendezvous in which several boosters would be docked up in space, and then a large rocket and a capsule would be sent directly to the moon, just like in the movies. So we'd be landing a fairly large rocket, spaceship, on the moon, and then returning this large spaceship to Earth. Dr. Hobart recommended a different version, that there would be the rendezvous would happen in lunar orbit. You'd have the component pieces of the command module and a lunar module, which in itself contained 2 stages, the descent stage and the ascent stage. The whole idea was to put as little weight on the moon as you could get away with, and then take away even less weight than you had before. Over a year goes by, there's been no decision. Dr. Siemens gets a letter from Dr. Hobalt, a 9-page letter, single-spaced, outlining his method. Siemens has just about had it with a good doctor, and he calls for a come-to-Jesus meeting. And at the meeting, Hobalt and his people present their method. Von Braun's people make a long presentation, and at the end of the presentation, von Braun stands up, thanks his people, and says that the lunar orbit rendezvous is the best way to go. So finally, in December of 1962, a contract is signed. So the lunar module gets a late start, and it is something that's never been done before. There is no precedent for the designers to look back on like they could with the command module. JFK. I should point out that the Apollo program is kicked off. There are other programs running in the background will be also running, like Gemini, and then we also have to wonder what the Russians are doing. JFK makes a speech in 1962, September, at Rice University, reinforcing the goal. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and to do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The following month, the Cuban Missile Crisis kicks in, which further muddies the relationships with the Soviet Union. In the following year, in September 1963, he has a talk with Jim Webb in the White House. Now, in that previous year, a secret recording system was put in the White House, and Evelyn Wood was his secretary. And you remember Evelyn Wood from Nixon fame? Anyway, in that conversation, I should point out, in the Vostok program, the final of the 6 missions was with a woman, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, 3 days. She had more time in orbit than the Mercury core combined. In a long meeting with Jim Webb, Kennedy says, it's been a couple of years, and right now I don't think space program has much political excitement. There's an election year coming up. Right now, space has lost a lot of its glamour. Then he says, if I get reelected, we're not going to the moon in our time, are we? It'll be 1968. Webb says no. Kennedy says we don't have anything coming up for the next 14 months. There'll be no flights during the campaign year. I'm going into the campaign to defend this program with little to show. And a few days later at the UN, he says, finally in a field for the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Sadly, he went to Dallas the following 2 months later. If he had lived to run for re-election on October 14th of that year, Soviets launched Voskhod 1, carrying a 3-man crew, a real shock. They're back in the game. We're just talking about the things that are going to be done to support the Apollo program, infrastructure. The Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston will be built, a huge facility. I have some familiarity with it. The large launch pads for this huge Saturn V missile, a vertical assembly building, nothing like it in the world. By the way, the Soviets did it a different way. They built their rockets horizontally and transported them to the pad, then lifted them. Again, different design approaches can have the same result. The Michoud facility, I worked there, is where they fabricated the Boeing S-1C. There's a Mississippi test site for the Saturn engines, and a worldwide tracking network because they had to maintain contact, continuing contact with the Apollo spacecraft, except when it went around the moon. Gemini. The Gemini program, first launch would be in May of 1965. I call it Gemini. Most of the astronauts and others call it Gemini. But I'm from Boston. The comparable spacecraft to the Gemini would be Voskhod, which is in English is sunrise. So in 1964, the Manned Spacecraft Center opens in Houston for expanded workforce required for the Gemini program. The Gemini program will determine if the Apollo program is feasible. The man-rated Titan II booster is chosen instead of on Braun rocket. So they don't have to expend money on research and development for a rocket. They're using an Air Force rocket that they've man-rated. For long-duration flight with complex assignments, a robust flight control program. So now we need flight controllers. If you're going to have astronauts in space for 10 or 12 days, you have to have some structure to control their flights. They're pilots, not passengers. As in Mercury, they had very little to do as a rule. There'll be 10 manned missions to demonstrate crew performance over periods of up to 12 days. Teamwork, a first spacewalk, rendezvous with another Gemini, and docking activity. The new astronaut team, there will be 15 more astronauts to add. Deke Slayton, who was grounded from the Mercury crew, is crew selection chief. He's pairing astronauts. Now, instead of individuals, you've got to pair people who are going to work together for 10 days and hope there's no friction between them. Gus Grissom was heavily involved in the development of the control panels. They dubbed it, his fellow astronauts dubbed it the Gusmobile. It was so designed around Grissom's 5'6" body that when NASA discovered that 14 of the astronauts were taller than Grissom, the interior had to be somewhat rejiggered. I met Gus Grissom in Houston. We literally bumped into each other. We tried to walk through the same door from different directions. So I did meet him. The Soviet program, knowing what we're going to do, because we've advertised it, we've named our crews, we named the dates, we named the backup crews. The Soviets do not do that. What they did was surprise us. They modified a Vostok capsule. Oh, I missed this one, the Apollo Manpower. Excuse me. You can see the large, use this format. You can see the growth spurt and then how it tapers off. So I came on board right around here. I probably left right around there. Back to the Voskhod. They took a single man capsule. They removed the ejection seat. They put in 3 cushions, 3 couches, a lot of foam padding. The quarters were so cramped that cosmonauts could not wear flight suits. So if anything would happen to compromise the cabin integrity, they would toast. During a single day in orbit, it accomplished a series of firsts, including carrying the first civilians into space. For example, there was a doctor on board the flight, Ovid. He was a flight surgeon, and he'd fly, and a chief engineer. When Voskhod 1 launched on October 12, 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was a leader of the Soviet Union. When the spacecraft landed the next day, Leonid Brezhnev was in charge, a bloodless coup. Voskhod 2 was launched on March 18, 1965, shortly before the first Gemini launch, and that was timed, of course. 2 men on board, Pavel Belyaev was a pilot, Alexei Leonov co-pilot. The spacecraft was equipped with spacecraft was equipped with a airlock here. This is the other astronaut. You're looking down on his helmet. There's the empty seat of Leonov. They have an extendable airlock that permitted Leonov's exit into space. He was the first man to perform an extravehicular activity in space. For this, a spacesuit was donned and a life support system was worn in a backpack. The EVA was recorded by mounted TV camera. It lasted for 20 minutes. But his spacesuit expanded greatly in vacuum of space, causing great difficulty in re-entering Voskhod. He almost didn't make it. He had to bleed enough air out of his suit that would allow him to get in without suffocating him. The flight lasted a little more than a day, 16 orbits. Their problems weren't over yet. What's going on here? A manually controlled reentry was performed because of a malfunction of the automatic orientation devices for the retrofire. And the spacecraft landed in a pine forest over 700 miles from the target area. After the recovery team located the spacecraft, one day was required to cut through the forest and bring the crew out of skis. This mission also caused Leonov to design a new space weapon. He designed a gun that could fire shells, shotgun shells, and normal bullets. It became standard issue on Soviet spacecraft, including the Soyuz, up until about 2005. The 10 Gemini flights were successful in demonstrating vital steps to a successful moon mission could be and were accomplished. During this period, the Soyuz spacecraft intended to take cosmonauts to the moon, had political and technical problems that began to hamper their progress. From May of 1965 to November of 66, Gemini astronauts did over 80 days in space, the Soviets only 3. So we seem to have a momentum shift. In 65, 6 cosmonauts wrote a Dear Leonid letter. They complained that they were being neglected, that automation was considered to be more important than man in the loop. We don't know if the letter ever reached Leonid's desk. We'll talk about the Soyuz for a moment. And you see the unique design, the 3 sections. The orbiting module, which is quite similar to the Vostok, the landing module, this is brand new, and a brand new service module, and it has solar panels, which is a first, and that was a problem. So they would take off and land seated in this landing module. This was extra space activity, and there would be a probe assembly for, in the future, docking with another Soyuz, part of their moon program. By the way, one of them is in orbit right now. It'll be coming down in April and be replaced by another one. So 60 years, almost 60 years later, they're still making these things because they're reliable. Oops, sorry. Comparison of the moon boosters. See the Saturn V, and the N1 is what Korolev is working on for the lunar program that they undertake. The first flight is in January. During this time, let me speak of the Soviet program. The Soviet Central Committee finally authorized a lunar program on October 3rd, 1964. 3.5 years after JFK's speech. They are a late start. They want the mission to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution, which doesn't give them much time because that's November of 1967. Rocket builders Korolev and Cholomey, another rocket designer, had 2 ideas that they pushed. Pardon me while I look for the Cholomai was for sending a man on a circumlunar mission. Korolev wanted an actual manned landing. Korolev's mission was based upon this huge N-1 rocket, which was also based upon the type of rockets, engines that he could get. The chief engine designer was on bad terms with Korolev going back to when they were both in the Gulag. He turned down Korolev's desire for using a liquid hydrogen-based engine instead, and then promoted Cholomai's Proton rocket. Korolev died. He died in the beginning of 1966, about 15 months after the program was initiated. He was replaced by his deputy, Mishin, who, while a good engineer and manager, was not the driving force that Korolev. Korolev was like von Braun on steroids in that program. We know that there was no public official message on the moon program being initiated. They always play it close to the vest. We do have Cholomai's Zond program, which that would be the circumlunar flight. And he actually had 2 flights that did that. One was Zond 5, and it carried 2 turtles. And it did the whole mission, it came back. However, during the mission, some Soviet cosmonauts thought they would have a little fun with the Americans. They patched into the telemetry loop, and they broadcast through the Zond 5 transmitter a conversation that cosmonauts would have in space, which for a brief time led us to believe that they had men going around the moon. They called themselves hooligans, and they were right. So the Soviet program effectively was dead-ended because they couldn't develop the N-1 rocket. But we didn't know that yet. When Korolev died, his name became known to the world. He was given a hero's funeral in Red Square. Chairman Brezhnev was a pallbearer. We'll talk about the Apollo program in a moment. We talked about the management of Jim Webb, Hugh Dryden, Bob Siemens. When they joined, they brought Tom Phillips on board. He ran the Minuteman program that built and emplaced 1,000 Minutemen in the 60s. He brought with him management tools. He also brought along 150 Air Force officers to ride herd on the prime and subprime contractors. They had the Apollo configuration manual. This is a Soviet moon lander, if they ever used it. 1 man. Their idea was 2 men to go to the moon orbit, and 1 man would make the descent and hopefully make the ascent. They were tough. Back to Sam Phillips. Formal milestones, design reviews, critical design reviews, first article controlled, flight readiness reviews. Astronauts would attend these important milestone meetings as well as visit prime contractor sites. I speak from experience. While at Grumman, I worked at 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. shifts 6 days a week. One evening, I was in the lunar module when a man came up and introduced himself. He was Rusty Swikert, Apollo 9 lunar module pilot. They also had the concept of Tiger teams. It's a group of knowledgeable engineers formed to tackle a specific problem. Management's role was to clear the way. Program developed fairly smoothly, considering what they were doing. One main program was the Apollo Guidance Computer, which is something brand new. You needed a real-time computer rather than a batch processor. That award was given to MIT's instrumentation lab, headed by Doc Draper, who was legendary in the field of inertial guidance. They came up with the idea of using integrated circuits, which were a brand new concept instead of transistors. A brand new industry. They were going to build a computer using basic integrated circuits with essentially a logic gate, one type of logic gate. But if you take 8,000 basic logic gates and are crafty enough, you can build a computer, which is what they did. They built it so that it would be 1 cubic foot in size, weigh less than 70 pounds, consume very little power, and have enough computing power to satisfy guidance and navigation. They were designed by M&T, and they were manufactured by Raytheon Company, where I went to work eventually. While I was a Raytheon engineer, at one point I worked at Draper Lab, this former instrumentation lab, where I met the esteemed Dr. Draper. Apollo software. You need a software for the lunar module and a command module. A team of young MIT programmers, including Margaret Hamilton. There's the listings for her handiwork. The tasked to develop a program that would complete the mission, but they only had 64,000 words of memory to work with. She would be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016, just as Katherine Johnson had been awarded the Medal of Honor the previous year. These programmers were mentored by Bill Tyndall of Data Resources at NASA. He stressed that no more than 85% of the memory could be used. He wanted it to be done simply. Finally, at Grumman, I was assigned to a Tiger team. They were behind schedule to ship Lunar Module 1 to the Cape. I went to work one evening and found that my white hard hat had been replaced by one with tiger stripes, so I was a tiger. It was a stressful time. I was in meetings where fistfights broke out. True, and we walked out, not being that kind of person. So we had some 400,000 people, prime contractors, NASA subcontractors, who put effort into this endeavor. Astronaut training, they trained on simulators. The astronauts also trained prime and backup crews, so most of the prime crews eventually had trained as backup crews, so they had extensive training. For example, on Apollo 12, Conrad, Bean, and Gordon had backed up Apollo 9. They spent a great deal of time in simulators, as did, this is the computer. Oops. Sorry. That's the computer. That's the user interface. It's very simple, just a keypad with 9 digits and a couple of functions like enter and clear. An astronaut slide rule, because they didn't have enough capacity to do trivial things. And the lunar module. You can see here, that's the tunnel that would dock with a command module, and they transfer through the tunnel into this ascent stage. The interior of the lunar module, you can see how crowded it is. No seats for weight saving, a door opened inward on the command side. They use restraints instead of seats. The window placement, whoops, I'm doing a bang-up job. You can see the windows looking out and down. The computer is over here. I spent time in this one, Lunar Module 1 anyway, in the fall, winter. And during Apollo 13 crisis, when they had to evacuate the command module, 3 men lived in this for 3 days. Exciting. I intend to be running late, I think. Let me just get to some serious things. We had 1967, a tragic year, because in that year, we had the loss of the astronauts Grissom, Chaffee, and White. They were in a final stage of testing prior to a first manned flight of an Apollo crew when a fire broke out in the capsule, causing the death of these 3 men. NASA had an investigation. They carried it out internally, which would have been unusual. They came to the conclusion that management was not a problem, there was poor engineering choices. It sounds right. The problem was they were testing in a 100% oxygen atmosphere at greater than normal pressure. So when a fire broke out, which would not have happened in a normal, even in a lower oxygen atmosphere, they were in trouble, and since the door opened inward and it took a lot of pressure, they were doomed. But we moved on. In 1968, we had turmoil and defeat for the U.S., massacre at My Lai on March 17th, assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, a racial upheaval, a riotous Democratic convention, and the space race was in hiatus. On October 11, 1968, 22 months after the final Gemini flight, Apollo 7 is launched on a 10-day low Earth orbit mission. They were on top of a Saturn 1B, not the Saturn V. The crew was Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham. Schirra is the only astronaut to fly Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo flights, and he retires after splashdown. On December 21, Apollo 8, with Borman, Lovell, and Anders on board, flew the first manned circumlunar mission. This mission was changed from a low Earth orbit in August to flying on a big Saturn V as an example of the all-up philosophy promoted by Miller and Phillips. If you can test one item and test another item, then you fly them, the next opportunity you fly them together instead of testing incrementally. This was a big step because it allowed them to catch up on their schedules. The crew were the first men to traverse the Earth's Van Allen belts. Their inspirational Christmas message, "All of you on the good earth," was sorely needed. An anonymous letter summed it up. Thank you, Apollo 8. You saved 1968. They were Time Magazine's Men of the Year. So this is the flight. They were on a large Saturn V, so they were using the mover. Mission control I should talk about, as we're running late. And it's interesting. This is where the flight surgeon would be in the stack. The flight director was here. Down in the first row, these are the trench, called the trench, where the booster and retro rocket men were. And that's a page from the mission plan. I'll show you that. I thought it was interesting. Apollo mission plan, page 60. This is when they land on the moon. They have instructions for the command module pilot, the lunar module commander, the lunar module pilot, telling them what commands to enter into the computer, what attitudes they have. And if you look down at the bottom, when they finally land, there is a stay, there was a stay-go point, and that's because if the lunar module were not perpendicular within a certain range, they were to leave because it would be an unstable position. Finally, this is the flight pan leaving the moon, the ascent stage. Instructions: don helmet and gloves. Verify restraints. It's like your mother when you're sending you out to play. But that was how they operated. They had a menu that they followed like a chef. Apollo 15 left this on the moon. Apollo 15, David Scott was commander and Jim Aaron was a lunar module pilot. 14 cosmonauts and astronauts. They included Grissom and Chaffee and White. 2 astronauts, C and Elliott, Gemini 9 crew, they died in a plane crash. Another American astronaut who died in a car crash, and the Soviet astronauts, including Yuri Gagarin, who died in a jet accident. Just to give you an idea what this thing cost in 1967 dollars, you can multiply it by about 9 or 10 to get it in today's dollars. Mercury was a bargain. Gemini was about 5 times as much. Then you had the 3 surveyor reconnaissance missions, and then Apollo. And I think we got our money's worth. The conclusion, since we're trying to determine how close it was, and it was. At one point, it looked like they might get a circumlunar flight in, but not a lunar landing, but they would have declared victory. In fact, a reporter from Pravda stated that they wouldn't let the world know that they had the mission or failed. So they pretended the mission never happened. But we were the first to cross the Van Allen belts, the first manned circumlunar mission on 8, first mission in lunar orbit on Apollo 10, first manned landing and return on Apollo 11. The USSR walks away, the first circumlunar mission and return with live animals, turtles, the first manned space station Salyut. Then there's a USSR joint venture. 1975, 2 of the all-stars, if you could say that, Tom Stafford, who flew 2 Gemini flights and who flew Apollo 10, and Alexei Leonov, the guy who flew Voskhod 2, meet up in a joint mission, the Cosmic Brotherhood. Leonov became a godfather to one of Tom's children, and in 2014, at Leonov's death, Stafford delivered the eulogy. So we have that, I guess, those different days. So I think this is it. I think I overspoke. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Hello?
Thank you, better.
I'm going to ask for questions, but please keep it short because we're running in time.
I know.
So if you have comments, keep them really short. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious what your reaction would be to the moon race of the 1960s and comparing that to the Artemis program, which seems to be at a snail's pace. I'd like your comments on that.
Yes. It reminds me of some of the plans they had for Apollo initially, a mishmash. What they're going to do is send their version of the command module into lunar orbit, where it's going to meet either the Gateway, which has not been built, or they'll rendezvous with the SpaceX. There'll be a transfer to a SpaceX rocket, and then the thing will 150 feet high. Lunar module is about 28, and just like a 1950s science fiction movie, this huge thing will land on the moon, and they'll take off again. But there's all manner of problems because they have to have enough fuel to accomplish a job, and to have enough fuel, you have to have enough fuel tankers to go into orbit, because if you want to put 10 tons of fuel into orbit, or 1 ton of fuel into orbit, you need about 100 tons of rocket and fuel to deliver the 10 tons you want. I had something here that demonstrated the pieces of the puzzle. And the Chinese will get there first, because the Chinese said they're going by 2030. Not